Chapter 18. The book sent for by Mr. Howitt came a few days after the adventure at the ranch, and Sammy, with all the intensity of her nature, plunged at once into the work mapped out for her by the shepherd. All through the long summers and autumn, the girl spent hours with her teacher out on the hillside. Seated on some rocky bench or reclining on the grassy slope, she would recite the lessons he gave her, or listen to him as he read aloud from character forming books, pausing now and then to slip in some comment to make the teaching clear or to answer her eager questions. At other times, while following the sheep, leisurely from one feeding ground to another, he provoked her to talk of the things they were reading, and, while he thus led her to think, he was carefully guarded her speech and language. At first, they took the old familiar path of early intellectual training, but little by little he taught her to find the way for herself. Always as she advanced, he encouraged her to look for the life that is more than just meat, and always while they read and talked together, there was open before them the great book wherein God was written in the language of mountains and trees and sky and flowers and brook, the things that make truly wise those who pause to read. From her mother, and from her own free life in the hills, Sammy had a beautiful body with the grace and strength of physical perfect womanhood, and with this she had inherited from many generations of gentlefolk a mind and spirit susceptible of the highest culture. Unspoiled by the hothouse and forcing process that so often leaves the intellectual powers jaded and weak, before they were fully developed and free from the atmosphere of falsehood and surface culture, in which so many souls struggle for their very existence, the girl took what her teacher had to offer and made it her own. With a mental appetite uninjured by tidbits and dainties, she digested the strong food and asked eagerly for more. Her progress was marvelous, and the old scholar often had cause to wonder at the quickness with which his pupil's clear mind grasped the truth he showed her. Often, before he could finish speaking, a bright nod or a word showed that she had caught the purpose of his speech, and while that wide, eager look and the question that followed revealed her readiness to go on. It was as though many of the things he sought to teach her slept already in her brain, and needed only a touch to arouse them to vigorous life. In time, the girl's very clothing, and even her manner of dressing her hair, came to reveal the development and the transformation of her inner self. Not that she dressed more expensively, she couldn't do that, but in the selection of materials and in the many subtle touches that showed distinction even to the plainest apparel. She showed her awakening. To help her in this, there was Aunt Molly and Good Ladies Magazine, which came to her regularly through the kindness of her teacher. Sammy's father, too, came unconsciously under the shepherd's influence. As his daughter grew, the man responded to the change in her, as he always responded to her in every thought and mood. He talked often now of the old home in the Southlands, and sometimes fell into the speech of the old days, dropping for a moment the rougher expressions of his associations. But all this was to Sammy alone. To the world, there was no change in Jim, and he still went on with his long rides with Wash Gibbs. By fall, the place was fixed up a bit, and the fence was rebuilt, and the yard trimmed, and another room was added to the cabin. And so the days slipped away over the wood-fringed ridges. The soft green of tree and the bush and grassy slope changed to a brilliant gold and crimson and russet brown, while the gray-blue haze that hangs always over the hollows took on a deeper purple tone. Then in turn this purple changed to a deeper, colder blue, when the leaves had fallen and the trees showed naked against the winter sky. With the cold weather and the lessons they were continued in the Lane cabin in the southern slope of Dewey. All day, while the shepherd was busy at the ranch, Sammy pored over her books, and every evening the old scholar climbed the hill to direct the work of his pupil with Jim sitting, silent and grim, by the fireside, listening to the talk and seeing who knows what visions of the long ago in the dancing flame. And so the winter passed, and the spring came again, came with the soft beauty of tender green, its wealth of blossoms and sweet fragrance of growing things, and then came the summer, that terrible summer, when all the promises of spring were broken, when no rain fell for weary months, and the settlers, in total failure of their crop, faced certain ruin. End of chapter 18. Chapter 19. The Drought. It began to be serious by the time the corn was waist high, when the growing grain lost its rich color and the long blades rustled dryly in the hot air. The settlers looked anxiously for signs of a coming rain. The one topic of conversation at the mill was always the condition of the crops. The stories were of all past droughts or tales of hardship and want. The moon changed, and still the same hot, dry sky, with only now and then a shred of cloud floating lazily across the blue. The grass in the glades grew parched and harsh, and the trees rattled their shriveled leaves. Creek beds lay glaring white and dusty in the sun, and all the wild things in the woods sought the distant river bottom. In the Mutton Hollow neighborhood, only the spring below the Matthews place still held water, and all day the stock on the range, crowding around the little pool, trampled out the narrow fringe of green grass around its edge and churned its bright life into mud in their struggle. Fall came, and there was no relief. Crops were a total failure. Many people were without means to buy food for themselves and their stock for the coming winter and the months until another crop could be grown and harvested. Family after family loaded their few household goods into the big covered wagons and deserted their homes, and set out to seek relief in more fortunate or more wealthy portions of the country. The day came at last when Sammy found the shepherd in the little grove near the deer lick and told him that she and her father were going to move. "Father says there's nothing else to do. Even if we could squeeze through the winter, we couldn't hold out until he could make another crop." Throwing herself onto the ground, she picked a big yellow daisy from a cluster that, finding a little moisture oozing from the dirt-filled crevice in the rock, had managed to live, and began pulling it to piece. In silence the old man watched her. He had not before realized how much of the companionship of this girl had come to mean to him. To the refined, cultivated scholar whose lot had been cast so strangely with the rude, crude people of the mountain wilderness, the companionship of such a spirit and mind was a necessity. Unconsciously, Sammy had supplied the one thing lacking, and by her demands upon his thought had kept the shepherd from mental stagnation and morbid brooding. Day after day she had grown into his life, his intellectual and spiritual child, and though she had dropped the rude speech of the native, she persisted in still calling him by his backwoods title, Dad. But the little word had come to hold a new meaning for them both. He saw now, all at once, what he would lose when she went away. One by one, the petals from the big daisy fell from the girl's hand, dull splashes of gold against her dress in the grass. "Where will you go?" he asked at last. Sammy shook her head without looking up. "I don't know. Anywhere that Daddy can earn a living. I mean a living for both of us." "And when do you leave?" "Pretty soon now. There's nothing to stay for now. Father told me that when he went away day before yesterday, that we'd go as soon as he returned. He promised to be home sometime this evening. I couldn't tell you before, Dad, but I guess you knew." The shepherd did in fact know. For weeks they had both avoided the subject. Sammy continued. I've just gone over to the Matthews place. Uncle Matt, he's been gone for 3 days now. I guess you know about that too. Aunt Mally, she told me all about it. Oh, I wish I could help them." She reached for another daisy, and two big tears rolled from under the long lashes to fall upon the golden petals. "We'll come back in the spring when it's time to plant again, but what if you're not here?" Her teacher could not answer for a time, and then he said, in an odd, hesitating way, "Have you heard from Ollie lately?" The girl raised her head, her quick, rare instinct divining his unspoken thought, and something she saw in his old face brought a hint of a smile to her own tearful eyes. She knew him so well. "You don't mean that, Dad. We just couldn't do that. I had a letter from him yesterday offering us money, but you know we couldn't accept that from him." And there the subject was dropped. They spent the afternoon together, and in the evening, at Sammy's lookout on the shoulder of Dewey, she bade him a good night, and left him alone with his flocks in the soft twilight. And that same evening Mr. Matthews returned from his trip to the settlement. End of chapter 19.